My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the United Kingdom continues to push for accountability for Russian war crimes in Ukraine, including via active participation in the core group established by Ukraine to explore options for a tribunal for the crime of aggression. My Lords, we are clear that Russia must pay for the damage it has caused to Ukraine and are working very closely with allies to explore all lawful routes by which immobilised Russian sovereign assets can be used to support Ukraine.
In thanking the Noble Lord the Minister for that reply, my Lords, has he seen the latest economic estimates beyond the suffering, the chronic injuries and the fatalities in Ukraine, that the economic costs are likely to come to some £1 trillion to rebuild Ukraine? And to facilitate some of that rebuilding, yesterday the House heard the Foreign Secretary say that he's eager to see the £44 billion of Russian assets frozen in the UK, along with the EU's €260 billion of frozen assets repurposed to help Ukraine, including the £2.5 billion sale of Chelsea Football Club. Could the Minister outline to the House the obstacles placed in the way of the repurposing of assets, for creation of a special tribunal which is referred to prosecute the mother of all crimes, the crime of aggression, and the circumvention of sanctions? And will he commit to chair a regular private meeting here in the House with members of your Lordship's House until the obstacles and disagreements are ironed out and progress is made in bringing to justice and bringing to account those responsible for these terrible deprivations and suffering that Ukraine has experienced?
My Lords, on the Noble Lord's last point, of course, both myself and indeed my noble friend Lord Cameron will keep the House updated on progress on this issue. I know my noble friend has made it a key priority on the issue of seizure of assets, and noble Lords would have heard directly from the Foreign Secretary on what he said. He was in Israel today, but he's travelling to the G7, where I know the issue of Ukraine, both in terms of accountability, the issue of sanctions, and indeed leveraging the sanctions which are being imposed on these assets is being used. We've previously discussed the EU and steps they're taking. And as my noble friend said yesterday, it's a point I've made several times from the dispatch box. We want to work in unison with our G7 partners, but also importantly with our partners in the EU, particularly with the assets currently held in Belgium, to ensure there's a real implication. But so far, just the sanctions have meant that we have denied Russia $400 billion that would have been used for the Russian war machine.
My Lords, one of the war crimes that Russia's committed in the Ukraine is the forcible abduction of 20,000 children, removing them from their parents. This morning on Novala Online, we got an indication of what that means in reality from a young Ukrainian called Denis, who was suffering from diabetes. He went to tell the Russian authorities that he was running low, and he was told that we do not supply insulin to pro-Ukrainians. So become pro-Russian or die. What kind of a regime is that?
My Lords, first of all, I recognise my noble friend consistently raising this issue of the abhorrent crimes of taking children from Ukraine to Russia. And we are all, I know I speak for every member of your Lordship's House, that this abhorrent practice must stop and stop immediately. We are working with key agencies, including the UN, to ensure return of these children rapidly, and it's something where it's regularly raised at G7 level, but bilaterally as well. And on the final point, again, it's another appalling example of what Russia's regime is doing, and doing not just to the Ukrainian people, but to the future of Ukraine as well.
In addition to the totality of the consequences of the aggression on Ukraine, as the Noble Lord Alton said, there are hundreds of thousands of individual victims which are being recorded under the Ukrainian register for damages. Does the Minister agree with me that a tribunal has a good opportunity of being the basis upon which repatriation, support for individual victims can be operated? And will the Minister also agree with me that there's nothing preventing the UK now instituting a windfall on the asset values rather than seizing the assets, so that we can start to provide individual support for individual victims, especially women who've been the victims of sexual aggression?
Yeah.
On the Noble Lord's final point, the Noble Lord will know that I am very much seized as the Prime Minister's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict, and particularly with a focus on Ukraine. We're working with the First Lady of Ukraine on this very issue. The register is an important element. That's why the UK has been a strong advocate. I indeed, at a previous meeting with our European partners, signed that particular register on behalf of the United Kingdom. And in terms of the accountability mechanisms, we're very much working with key partners, including the US, to ensure that we get the right mechanism to ensure it's legally based, internationally founded and applied, and ultimately provides accountability and indeed provides support to those tragic victims and indeed survivors of the crimes the Noble Lord alludes to.
Support Lord Alton's question, but can the Minister assure the House that the penalties dished out to Mr Putin and his cronies really are limited to those people responsible for the war crimes in Ukraine? I lived and worked in Russia for several years, and I know a lot of senior Russians who are utterly decent and who would never support the war crimes that were committed in Ukraine. So can I just appeal to the Minister to assure us that there will be care taken in punishing only those responsible?
I can assure the Noble Lady, and on a personal anecdote, she talks about Russians. Our fight is not with the Russian people. I know of a child who's at my son's school, whose mother, he's half Russian, half Spanish, and he's not going back to Russia to see his grandparents because of the fear of what consequences may face a young child who's just started off in life.
Can I just return?
My lords, I don't think the Labour benches have yet had a chance. If I may. My lords, as we're talking about war criminals and crimes committed by the Russians, there is a matter of concern still that the International Criminal Court Act of 2001 confines prosecutions of war criminals coming into this country to people who are nationals or who have residency here. And I wonder whether we're making any progress on amending that legislation so that we can prosecute people who come through here, often coming to look at schools for their children, often coming to look at universities for their children, and often coming to shop at Harrods. Can we do something about providing the ability to arrest those people?
My Lords, the Noble Lady will be aware, of course, that we work very closely with international agencies. Most notably, we're working closely with the ICC in terms of the warrants that have been issued against key Russians, including the President of Russia, and of course those would apply. I know the Noble Lady's raised this particular issue with me directly as well. I think we need to look at what mechanisms can be applied. But ultimately, if there is someone who is committed, as we've just heard from the crossbenchers as well, that those people who are responsible for these abhorrent crimes should be held accountable.
Can I just, my Lords, return to the issue of Chelsea Football Club? We heard from my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, yesterday and sensed his frustration. This is £2.5 billion, which is effectively frozen, we're told, because of disagreement between ourselves and others in Europe. Surely this is completely unacceptable. Can the noble friend, my noble friend, the Minister, reassure this House that actually, across government, we are working very, very hard to release this money? It's been sitting for far too long, and it should be spent where it was meant to be spent, and that is on alleviating the suffering of the Ukrainian people.
And first of all, on a lighter note, charmed that my noble friend referred to me as the noble friend, and I take that on board quite directly. But equally, on the more serious point he makes, I absolutely agree with my noble friend, and the Foreign Secretary is also seized with this matter.
Can I push the noble Lord the Minister on how do we hold to account the President of Russia for the act of aggression? And we have had discussions in the G7 since April 23 on establishing a tribunal, a special tribunal, so we can actually prosecute the people responsible. Can he update us on the discussions in G7 so we can move this matter forward and speedily, so we can be guaranteed that we hold these people to account?
Well, I've already alluded to the fact that my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, will be meeting with G7 partners in Italy during the course of this week, and this is one of the particular points will be raised. There are various options on the table. We're working very closely with the ICC. The ICC prosecutor has particular views on this, but equally we're aware of the independent tribunal that the Ukrainians have asked for, and there are some other variations on that. I assure the noble lord that as these progress, we are very much prioritising this. We want to see accountability, but in a manner which can be applied consistently with all key partners.